Hello everyone, in this video I'm going to take the game script from part 3 and add enemies to the game, although first I'm going to change this block that the game uses to something less distracting. These blocks aren't how you would typically see a normal level in Mario, so I added this tile of red blocks to the graphics folder. All I have to do is go to the platform class, go to self.image, and change the name of the file in the load path to the name of the new tile. Now the game looks more like a normal level, except that there are no enemies, so I'm going to try adding a Goomba to the game. The first thing I need to do is get the graphics and make them usable in Pygame. So I went online and I got this Super Mario Bros. Enemies sprite sheet. Then I generated the code for these 3 frames using my sprite mapping utility. Once I have the code for the frames copied into my game script, I can start writing the enemy class. The enemy class is going to be very similar to the player class, so much so that it's basically just a modified copy of the player class. The class Goomba is going to be an entity just like the player class. We'll use xval and yval to move the sprite around. Setting the x velocity to 1 will make the Goomba move 1 pixel to the right on every update. Using onGround will make it so the Goombas can fall off of platforms. Then we have a variable called destroyed for when the Goomba is destroyed by the player. We have a counter variable for the animation function, which will be the same as the player's animation function, but with different graphics. Self.image will be set to the first frame of the walk loop, since that's the first animation loop the Goomba will use. Then the rect property will be x and y, that's defined when it's created, and its size is the original size of the image multiplied by 3. Then we have the update function, which accepts platforms as an argument. The player update function also accepted the input variables, but since the Goomba isn't going to be moved by the arrow keys, the Goomba's update function obviously won't need them. Which of course means all the if statements testing the input variables aren't needed either. We do still want to keep if not self.onGround so the Goomba can fall if it's not on a platform. Then we can move the sprite and do the x and y collisions just like the player does. The collide function is actually just going to be a direct copy from the player class. Nothing needs to be changed here yet, so the Goomba will collide with the platforms the same way the player does. The last function run in the update is the animate function, which does the same thing as it does in the player class. We use some if statements to check the state of the sprite object. Goombas only have 2 states, either they're alive and walking around or they're dead. If they're alive, run the walk loop. If they're dead, run the destroy loop. The walk loop uses the 2 frames of the Goomba walking. The destroy loop uses the 1 frame of the flattened Goomba. Then it uses self.kill after 10 updates to remove the sprite from the screen. Then of course it has update character, which is used to update the self.image property. Only the code to flip the image isn't here because Goombas only face one direction. So now we have the entire Goomba enemy class, and we can add a Goomba to the game. We add the Goomba pretty much the same way we add the player. Goomba equals Goomba and a set of x and y coordinates. So where should I put the Goomba? I'm going to put both the player and the Goomba at the bottom of the screen. If they both just shot out of the upper left corner of the screen when you started the script, it would look a little odd. So I'm going to use this level array to find the bottom of the screen. If I were to count these P's above this lower platform, there would be 23 P's above it, which means this platform is 23 platforms down from the top of the level. So for the Y position of the Goomba, I just use the size of the platforms times 23. For Mario's Y position, I use the size of the platform times 22, because Mario is 2 platform lengths tall, so he needs to be placed 1 platform higher than the Goomba. Then I'll move the Goomba 6 platforms to the right, so the Goomba will start on the right side of Mario. Now that the Goomba object is created, I can add it to the entity sprite group, and add its update function under the player's update function in the main loop. Then all I have to do is run the script. And now we have a Goomba that casually walks across the screen. and that's all it's going to do. Depending on how Pygame loaded the two sprites in the entity sprite group, Mario will either pass in front of or behind the Goomba. The Goomba can't harm Mario in any way. It can't be destroyed by Mario, and it can't even turn around when it runs into a wall. It'll just get stuck in the corner, still trying to go right. Making the Goomba turn around is pretty easy. You go to its collide function, and when it runs into a wall on the right side, you set the x-val to negative the absolute value of the x-velocity, so the x-velocity will always become negative. For the left side collisions, you use the absolute value of the x-velocity, so the velocity will always become positive. I'm also going to change the Goomba's x-val to -1 so that he starts out moving towards Mario. That way he can get to a wall much faster and it won't take as long to test to see if it works. Now the Goomba should be able to move back and forth across the bottom of the screen without getting stuck. But he's still no threat to Mario. Making the Goomba able to hurt Mario will actually involve editing Mario, not the Goomba. In the player's collide function, it uses a for loop to test for collisions against every platform in the platform array. Now we want to test for a collision between the player and an enemy sprite that's in the entity sprite group. You could find which sprite in that group is the enemy, but you're better off just putting the enemy into its own group. Then you could use this new group to hold all your enemy sprites. So I'll say for E in enemy group, or for every enemy in the enemy sprite group. If the player collides with any of them, then I'm going to stop the program. If the player touches a Goomba, then the game is over. Normally you would have a player death animation here and then a game over screen, but this should be good enough for now. I'll scroll back up to the top of the script so I can create the new sprite group I'm planning to use. Then I'll add the Goomba to that sprite group. Then down at the bottom of the main loop I have the code that draws all the sprites in the entity sprite group, so I'll just make a copy of that loop and have it draw all the sprites in the enemy sprite group. Then in the player update line I need to add the enemy group as an argument. That way the player class will be able to use it in its collide function. So I'll go back down to the update function and kind of just connect the dots. The update function receives enemy group as an argument. It's passed to both the collide functions, and then the collide function receives it. So now enemy group is a real variable I can use in this test, rather than something I just made up. So I'll run the script and see if touching the Goomba stops the game. I admit that just stopping the game is kind of boring, but I don't want to elaborate too much on what should happen when the player takes a hit, because that can be very different depending on the character. Often characters will be knocked back or become temporarily invincible. A lot of things could happen, so I'm just going to work on destroying this Goomba. Similar to the player class needing a copy of the enemy sprite group, the Goomba class will need a copy of the entity sprite group. So in the Goomba update call, I'll add the entity sprite group as an argument. Then I'll go down to the Goomba class and have update accept entities as an argument. Then entities will be passed to the two collide functions. And then the collide function accepts entities as an argument. Now we can test to see if the enemy has collided with the player. Then we'll be able to test if it's collided with the player in a way that will destroy the enemy. So we'll say for player in entities, if the enemy collides with the player, it should die, or nothing will happen, depending on where the player is. If the player is above the Goomba when they collide, then the Goomba should die. I can find out how high up Mario is compared to the enemy by measuring the difference between the bottom of Mario and the top of the enemy. If the difference is only a few pixels, then the bottom of Mario is very near the top of the enemy. So we'll say that's a hit for Mario and the Goomba will die. Otherwise, nothing happens. The player will take a hit, causing a game over. Although right now the player will take a hit no matter what, since it's currently programmed to stop the game if it touches any pixel on the Goomba. We changed the rules for the Goomba, so now we have to change the rules for the player. We'll measure the difference again, and if Mario is above the Goomba, we'll give Mario a negative Y velocity. This will essentially throw Mario in the air, making him bounce off of the enemy. The amount of negative velocity determines how high Mario will bounce off of enemies. It's interesting to experiment with different Y velocities to see how high he can bounce. I think I have it at a pretty good spot though. Any higher and he would be launched into the bricks above the Goomba. I also tried changing the difference test to pass any difference between the objects and got some interesting results. If you run into a Goomba, it will launch Mario into the air. It actually kind of makes it feel more like a Sonic game, and the Goombas are just ramps that send Mario flying across the level. Hitting the Goomba over and over kind of reminds me of Excitebike. Also, I noticed when I run the code this way, the Goombas always seem to gain an extra hit point for some reason. If you jump on the Goomba right away, you'll destroy him with the first hit every time. But if you run him over like a ramp, then he can take 2 hits. I found out that as long as you run him over, he will gain a new hit point every time. It seems weird since I didn't program any hit points into the game, yet somehow they still seem to be there. But I guess that's what I can expect when I deliberately try to break the game. If I set the diff back to what it was, the glitch will be gone and the game will behave normally. So we added one enemy and it was pretty fun, so let's add another Goomba to the game. You could say Goomba 2 equals Goomba, but I think it's better just to add the Goomba to the sprite group as it's created. That way you can create a Goomba and add it to the sprite group using only one line. Then we can get rid of adding Goomba to the enemy group because the enemies have already been added. Then instead of writing Goomba1.update, Goomba2.update, I'll just have the loop that draws the enemies to the screen run the update function for every sprite in the group. That way I don't have to try to update them individually. Now it's easy to add any number of Goombas because all I have to do is copy this enemy.add line and give it new X and Y coordinates. It is pretty cool to have more enemies to jump on, but I noticed that if Mario bounces off a Goomba then tries to land on another Goomba, Mario won't bounce again. But if Mario lands on the ground before he bounces, he will always bounce off of the next Goomba. It's similar to how the Goombas had an extra hit point, so I guess I have to investigate that glitch after all. The problem turned out to be that depending on Mario's Y velocity, he could be as far as 8 pixels below the top of the enemy on a single update, which means at the right velocity he would never hit the target zone on the top of the Goomba and die instantly. Changing the difference test to 8 pixels solved the problem. So now the game script can support having multiple enemies, and they do seem to work properly. Mario can now attack the enemies or be foiled by them. Now we could put the Goombas at different elevations around the map so that they fall all over the place, which is kind of fun to watch, but it does make it apparent that the game needs objectives. So in the next video I'll update the script so that it can use more than one tile for the platforms, and I'll create a level for Mario that has an actual objective. So I hope this tutorial was helpful to you, and thanks for watching.